Hello and welcome everyone. This is my first post on this YouTube channel, JD Auto Gear. I won't bore you with the introductory details, but this is my Lexus GS F behind me, the 10th anniversary edition. And today I'm going to be installing wheel spacers from Bonoss. So the original fitment is decent. So I wanted only about 15 millimeters of a spacer for the rear. And then for the front wheels, we have 255s, and there's a decent amount of overhang from the fender to the actual wheel. So that's where I'll be using the 20 millimeter spacers. So these spacers are hub centric, and the studs are also mounted within the spacer itself. Now there were some other reputable brands that I thought about getting, but they all required installing your own studs, or extended studs into the car itself and not within the spacer until you went up to a certain size. You'll see right here, the edge is knurled, so this creates more surface area with air. This will sort of create some active cooling for the spacer itself, as well as these grooves over here, so the pocket of air will go in and exhaust out over here. Another great feature is these little notches in the spacer that allow you to use a flathead or pry tool. My only stipulation is the lug nuts for the 15 millimeter spacer is kind of small, but the reason why these are smaller is that they have to mount within these pockets right here. Obviously it makes sense. I'm not really concerned about it, but just something that crossed my mind. Another nice thing is that you get a 10-year limited warranty with these guys. So these start at around $122 for the 15 millimeter spacers and go up with size, obviously. So for the sake of instruction, I'm gonna start with the rear of the car, and I want to jack up on the pinch weld here underneath the rear door. Your car may vary, but for the Lexus GS F, you have 4 pinch weld points, 2 for the rear, 2 for the front. And this will work for jacking up the car. And I'm just gonna leave it on the jack lift. And make sure to put a chop block or something to keep the wheels from rolling on the opposite side of the car. So in this instance, I'm lifting up the rear driver's side of the car, so I am blocking off the front passenger side of the car. So that is the pinch weld right there, our jack point. And that is where this jack will meet with the pinch weld, and you'll see there's a little cutout right over here. And I want to make sure this frame rail right here sits somewhere within this cutout. Okay, it looks good on this side. Make sure to check the other side. And it looks like this side is good as well. So we should be good with lifting up the car. And before you jack up the car, make sure you break all the lug nuts loose with the breaker bar. And for the Lexus GS F, the OEM wheels take a 21 millimeter socket. And we just have the wheel slightly lifted off the ground. Don't need to go too high or too crazy or anything like that. So I'm not using any jack stands with this. I'm only using the floor jack, which is fine for me right now because this is temporarily going up and coming back down. Now we're gonna fully take off the rest of the lug nuts. Once the lug nuts are removed, if the wheel hasn't come loose, just give it a little bit of tap and the seal should break loose. Unless your car is much older, then it might require a little bit more effort. As you can see, there's a good bit of rust on here. So I'm going to take a wire brush and clean the surface of this. It's not absolutely required, but it does help the longevity of the wheel spacer that you'll be using so that the rust doesn't have any potential to eat into your wheel spacer, or at least reduce the risk, and also reduce the risk of really binding tightly. I'm not too worried about that, again, because the wheel spacer is coated, but I'm just going to do it for safekeeping. I'm also going to use this tar and sap remover to remove any additional rust, or at least clean it up a little bit. And then have a shop rag. Let's clean this up a little bit. You might actually want to spray the tar and sap remover before you start scrubbing off the rust, just so that the rust doesn't become airborne and you breathe it in. Some people would recommend putting anti-seize on the back, but again, I'm not too worried about it because of the coating. These spacers are actually fairly tight on the hubs here. So you gotta make sure you're absolutely flat when putting it on. And the way you can tell is that you still have a little bit of maneuverability side to side, so that when you're tightening down your lug nuts, you can adjust accordingly. And when you take it off, same thing. Be very equal on all sides on how you're putting it down. Once you've got your spacer properly on there, you can hand tighten the lug nuts and go in the star pattern in terms of tightening, just like you would with the wheel. And you want the bulbous side facing downwards or in towards the wheel. And these lug nuts are 19 millimeters. Now we're gonna move over to the torque wrench. Okay, so I'm going to set my torque wrench down to 76 foot-pounds, which is what Lexus recommends for the lug nuts. So if they want their wheel lug nuts tightened to 76, I'm gonna use the same thing for the wheel spacers. And I'm just gonna double check. So this guy's pretty good and ready to go. We can now mount the wheel. So if you notice, the OEM wheel studs are sticking out a little bit from the surface of the wheel spacer. So you wanna make sure that your surface, your mounting surface with your wheel, has a pocket for these to sit in so that they are not coming into contact with the wheel. And this is what I mean about that pocket. So these have pockets in here, and the OEM wheel studs can actually fit in here so that the mounting surface is nice and flush with the spacer. Okay, now I'm gonna line up the studs on the spacer with the wheel. And I'm just gonna start threading these by hand. I don't wanna automatically use a drill or an impact wrench just yet, or for any potential risk of stripping the stud. Okay, once I've got these started by hand, I'll go back in a star formation and just tighten these down. Not all the way, of course, just a little bit at a time, because there's still movement in the wheel. And now we can slowly and carefully lower our jack. Time to go back in with the torque wrench and torque all these down, once again in a star formation. And then I'm gonna go once more around just to hear for the click, just to make sure everything's nice and even. All right, now you can see that wheel just is nice and flush. And for reference, this is the other rear wheel. Now, same thing, but with the front of the car. Slide the chop block underneath the opposite side, jack up the car, get the rest of the lug nuts off and take off the wheel. Clean off the rotor mounting surface, evenly mount the spacer around the hub. Also check for that rotation, make sure there's some wiggle room. Hand tighten the spacer lug nuts. So the front rotor will be spinning when we try to torque these down. So you want to have a crowbar or someone pressing on the brake to keep this from rotating, and pretty much you're wedging it in between two of the wheel studs and keeping it from rotating by keeping one end on the ground planted. So you see that it wants to rotate this way when we tighten things down, so we want to keep that from rotating just like so. We're going to still try to maintain the star formation in terms of tightening things, so you're going to have to work around the crowbar. So you try to maintain a star formation if you can. It can get a little confusing, but just double check that all of them are properly torqued down. Now you can mount the wheel. Just for reference, this is the other front wheel that I haven't attached a spacer to. Now let's go see the other side. Oh yeah, that's a flush fitment right there. That looks real good. Now I'm gonna repeat the same process and then she'll be all done. All right, so I've finished installing all 4 spacers. This is what that fitment looks like. It looks pretty nice in my opinion. Now the last thing to do is pretty much test out the wheel spacers, check for any rubbing either going forward or reverse while turning the wheel either way, and also doing a couple of launches just to make sure I'm not shearing off the studs or anything like that, and I'll report back to you. Let's try full tilt to the side here. So after using these spacers on the GSF for a little while, I have noticed only one instance of rubbing. It's a very specific scenario, and it's only the passenger side front tire. And I have to be going in reverse on a slight incline and with the wheel pointed about 75 degrees to the right. So it's only on that side. The left side does not mimic that behavior. Maybe a quirk with my vehicle alone. Not every GSF is made the same. That goes for any model, but that's the only rubbing I have, and I'm willing to live with that since it's very specific and very minimal. Aside from that, I haven't had any other issues with these wheel spacers. I ended up swapping out the 20 millimeters in the front with the 15 in the rear, and I just wanted a wider stance in the rear and a more narrow stance in the front to give it a more muscular look. It looks very good. You tried so hard not to make a noise.
I tried.